I assume you've already installed a testing server and are raring to go. Before we can start, it's important to make sure we're all using the same basic settings. So we're going to run a very simple PHP command to inspect how PHP has been configured. Fire up your editing program. I'm using PHP Storm, and I've already set up a project to save all of my files in the Introducing PHP folder in my server document root. Create a blank file. I'm going to create it in the chapter 101_01 folder. And I'm going to call it config.php. My editing program automatically adds the .php on the end of the file name, and it also inserts the PHP opening tag on the first line. If your editing program adds HTML code, delete all of the HTML and replace it with this opening PHP tag on the first line. It's an opening angle bracket or less than symbol, a question mark, and then PHP, and make sure there are no spaces between any of the characters. Then insert a space after the opening PHP tag and type PHP info followed by a pair of parentheses and a semicolon. That's all we need to type. There won't be any other script in this file, so we don't need a closing PHP tag, but it doesn't matter if you add one. Just save the page and then load it into a browser. Now I can load directly from my editing program, but if necessary, if you've set up the same as I have, the URL in your browser will be localhost/introducingphp/ch01/01/config.php. And this configuration page contains a huge amount of information, and the contents will differ depending on how your server has been set up. If you've never used PHP before, this can seem like information overload. Fortunately, you don't need to worry about most of it. Let's just highlight some of the most important points. Right at the very top is the PHP version number. I'm using PHP version 7.0.0 RC4. RC stands for Release Candidate. I recorded this course shortly before the final release of PHP 7, so the version I'm using contains exactly the same features as the final release, but it was still going through some final quality tests. The final release of PHP 7 should be available by the time you watch this. You don't need to be using PHP 7 yourself, but do make sure that the version is not less than PHP 5.4. There were important changes in PHP 5.4, and if you're using an older version, some of the code in this course won't work. Now, halfway down the screen here is Loaded Configuration File. This is the location of the main configuration file, php.ini. You need to make a note of the location because you might need to edit it. So this is where my php.ini is. That's the active version of php.ini. Then let's scroll down, and this configuration section lists in alphabetical order all of the features enabled on your server. The one that we want to look at is called Core. So let's just scroll down, and here we are, Core. And what we want to look at in here is this one here, display_errors. This tells you whether error messages are displayed on screen, and the value that you need to look at is the one listed under local value, and in my case it's on. That's exactly what we want. If it's set to off in your system, some errors will result in a completely blank screen. In a live website, that's exactly what you want. Displaying errors can reveal information that could expose you to malicious attacks. However, in a testing environment, it's vital to see all error messages. So if display_errors is set to off on your local computer, you'll need to change this setting as described in the next video. Then the next thing we need to look at is error_reporting. It's this one here. And it's a numeric value, and it should be set to 32767 as shown here. If it shows a lower value on your system, follow the instructions in the next video. And there's one other setting that you should check. It's a bit further down. It's in the date section. Let's just find that. Here we are, date. Make sure there's a value for default time zone. I'm based in the UK, so I've set it on my system to Europe/London. If the time zone is wrong for your location, time and date functions will display the wrong values. So that's all we need to do. Those are the most important settings. If you ever ask for help with a PHP feature not working as expected, the first question you're likely to be asked is whether you've run PHP info to check if the feature is enabled. Although this page feels overwhelming when you first start out, you'll quickly learn to value the insight it gives you into your server's configuration. In the next video, I'll show you how to change the configuration settings on your server. You've seen how to check the configuration of your server using PHP info. If you need to make any changes, you need to edit the PHP configuration file php.ini. The location of the file depends on your server. It's listed here as loaded configuration file, so that's the location of php.ini on my server. You also need to check this value here, additional .ini files parsed. Usually the value is none, as it is here, but it's possible that something else is overriding values in the main configuration file. We'll come back to that later. First, let's deal with the main version of php.ini that's listed as the loaded configuration file. php.ini is just a plain text file, so you need to open it in a text editor. In Windows, double-clicking the file in the File Explorer automatically opens it in Notepad. On a Mac, it doesn't have a default program to open it. So I'm going to use this program, Text Wrangler, which is a free script editor for the Mac that you can download from www.barebones.com. But if you're on Windows, Notepad is just fine. And because I've been working with php.ini, it's already loaded it into Text Wrangler. And lines that begin with semicolons, like all of these lines here, are comments. The configuration commands are on lines that don't begin with a semicolon. And because it's such a long file, it's best to use the script editor's search command to find the configuration setting you're looking for. So I'm going to search for error_reporting and then click next. And here is a line that begins with a semicolon. So that's a comment. That's not what we want. So let's search for the next one. And this line here doesn't begin with a semicolon, so this is the actual command. And the value of error reporting is set to E_all in uppercase. This is a PHP constant, so it must be always in uppercase. And this is the value that you should have. This results in even minor errors being reported. Some developers prefer a less strict level, but I think it's very important to see every error message, particularly when you're learning. So make sure that that is set to E_all. The next thing that we need to look at is display_errors, and that's actually very close by. Here it is. In my version, display_errors equals on. That's what we want in a local testing environment. Now the default value in MAMP is off, so you must change this to on. The last configuration command you might need to change is date.timezone. So let's search for that. And this is on a comment line, but the next line doesn't have a semicolon at the beginning, so that's the actual value. So date.timezone, I've set it to Europe/London. The value is normally a continent or ocean, followed by a slash and the name of a city. This is because PHP automatically adjusts for daylight saving time, and you can find the correct time zone setting for your location in the PHP online documentation. So let's take a look at that. And this is a list of all the supported time zones in PHP, and there's a very large number of them, and they're all organized geographically. America covers the whole of the American continent, north, south, and central. But something which is important to realize about America is that it doesn't include offshore islands. So, for example, if you're in Hawaii, you actually have to look in Pacific because that's where Hawaii is listed. And Europe, that lists most of the countries in Europe, but some offshore islands are listed as being in Atlantic. Find the correct location and then change the value of date.timezone in your php.ini. And when you've made the changes, save php.ini and restart the web server. Then reload the script that runs php info. So this is php info here, and when you've made the changes, you should be able to see the changes reflected in here. And those changes will normally be listed in core under local value, or in the case of date, also under local value, but of course not in the core section, it's in the date section. However, if the changes didn't take effect and a file is listed alongside additional .ini files parsed, that was up here at the top. If you've got a different file listed here, then locate that file and make the changes there too. Making changes to your testing server configuration through editing php.ini sounds a daunting prospect because it's such a long file, but it's really quite simple. Just make sure you edit the configuration settings on lines that don't begin with a semicolon. And don't forget to restart your web server after making the changes. You can still change configuration settings even if you can't edit the main PHP configuration file, php.ini. In this video, I'll cover briefly 3 alternative approaches. This can be useful if the company hosting your website doesn't give you control over php.ini. The most common alternative is to use a file called .htaccess, but this works only if your server is running Apache. In the exercise files in the chapter 101_03 folder, I've created this file, htaccess.txt. And this shows you how to change the configuration settings on Apache for error reporting, display errors, and date.timezone. The lines that begin with a hash or pound sign are treated as comments, so the lines that don't have the pound or hash sign are the actual configuration directives. Each setting must be on a separate line, and where the configuration directive sets a value, the line begins with php_value, followed by a space, the name of the directive that you want to set, another space, and then the value. In the case of error_reporting, you need to use an actual number rather than e_all, because Apache doesn't understand PHP constants. When the directive toggles a setting on or off, the line begins with php_flag, then the name of the directive, and after a space, either on or off. To change the settings on an Apache server, save this file in the server's document root folder as .htaccess and remove the .txt on the end of the file name. I've put that .txt on the end of the file name because on a Mac, file names that begin with a dot are hidden in the Mac Finder. Using a .htaccess file has an immediate effect. There's no need to restart the web server. Some installations of PHP support a different type of user configuration file called .user.ini, and there's an example of that here in user.ini.txt. This uses exactly the same syntax as php.ini. So if you check with your hosting company and it says that it supports .user.ini files, you can rename this file, just take off the .txt on the end and begin it with .user.ini, and then you can upload it to your remote server and it will change the configuration settings. If neither of these alternatives is available to you, or if you simply want to change the settings for a single file, you can change some settings on the fly at runtime, and there's an example of how to do that in this file, runtime_config.php. For most settings, you use ini_set, and then between a pair of parentheses, the first argument is the configuration setting that you want to change, then after a comma, the value that you want to set it to. In the case of e_all, that's a PHP constant, so it's not in quotes, but normally the second value should be in quotes. And if you want to change the time zone setting, you need to use date_default underscore time zone underscore set, and then between the parentheses, the time zone setting. So that's 3 alternative ways to change configuration settings in PHP. You should consider these only if you don't have direct access to editing the main configuration file, php.ini. If your web server is running Apache, you can use this style, the .htaccess style. If your server supports .user.ini, you use this style, and then if you want to change just at runtime, you can use this ini_set. But this is the least efficient way to do it, unless you need to make only a temporary change, or to make the change for a specific script.